All right. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today for our online event, Maine's Environment in the 2025 Legislative Session, Progress and Outcomes. My name is Emmy Taberge, and I'm the Outreach Director at the Natural Resources Council of Maine. NRCM is the state's leading nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental advocacy organization dedicated to protecting, restoring, and conserving Maine's environment now and for future generations. Since 1959, NRCM has harnessed the power of the law, science, and the voices of people like you to protect the nature of Maine. Before we get started today, we want to acknowledge that the work we do in Maine is on the unceded territory of the Wabanaki Nations, who have stewarded this land for time immemorial. NRCM works alongside the Wabanaki Nations, including in support of the effort to achieve state recognition of inherent tribal sovereignty and to protect our natural resources and wildlife. We are committed to actively using our voices, our resources, and our power to do so. Now, before we get started, I just want to cover some housekeeping items. The next slide will show us what we're covering in today's program. This event is being recorded and is going to be posted on our YouTube channel if you'd like to review anything after, or if you'd like to share it with your friends. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A box you'll find on your menu at the bottom of the screen. And we'll try to save time at the end of the presentation for questions, but if we run out of time, we'll be sure to respond to your questions via email. We'll also be monitoring the chat throughout the presentation, and we can pull some questions from there. All right. Well, as we close out another legislative session, we want to take this moment to acknowledge and thank you and so many others like you from around the state who have made a difference this legislative session. The legislative session isn't just about laws, it's about people and embracing challenges and opportunities together. NRCM is committed to listening, learning, and expanding our statewide community so that we can speak up for what matters most to Maine people and to provide opportunities that bring supporters together to advocate for Maine's environment that we all love. Nearly 3,000 people around Maine took action with NRCM this legislative session by visiting the State House to speak with their legislators, attending or testifying at public hearings, contacting their legislators in other ways. And your voice really made a difference. Thank you. All right, let's get started. I am joined today by our staff experts who will share outcomes from this legislative session. I'd first like to introduce Pete Didesheim, NRCM's Senior Director of Advocacy, to provide an overview and highlights from the session. Pete?
Great, and let me also say thank you to all of you who are here with us today, and special thanks to all of you who took action this session to help influence the outcomes. And we're delighted to be here with you today, one day after the legislature has adjourned for the year, which is quite exciting and a relief in many ways for us. And we are looking forward to sharing with you the results of this session. So just a snapshot of what happens under the dome each year. There's 186 legislators who come together. It's really incredible. And they're trying to figure out what to do with nearly 2,000 bills that they've introduced. And they have people coming at them for 5-6 months in a row. Lobbyists, members of the public, legislative staff, agency staff, the administration, everyone's telling them what to do, including us. So we spend a lot of time chasing legislators, telling them what to do. We tracked 277 bills this year, and we testified on 102 bills. So the experts that are about to give you their assessment of what happened, we're over at the State House. There was 7 of us who spend a lot of time building relationships with legislators, sharing information in a very dynamic context. And next slide. And the context that we were dealing with this year was really partisan. I think it's been one of the most partisan legislative sessions that I can recall in quite some time. There was some very charged debates, very emotional debates, very strongly held positions on issues that are divisive within our culture, anti-trans issues and gun safety and immigration and budget issues. And so that kind of set the context. Unfortunately, I think it had the result of pushing the parties apart at times. But also there was many bills that did garner bipartisan support. So, and it's a citizen legislature where everybody there is not paid very much and they work really hard and they're doing their best to serve the public interest of the state. And it's inspiring in many ways. And getting to know these legislators is really important So thank you, all of you who have done some of that this session. This year, there were a lot of rollback bills, the most we've seen since 2011. We'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. Next slide. So this is a typical scene of the State House, and Sam Saltonstall, I think you're on this call, and there are a few NRCM members who are talking with Dan Ankleys, who's facing towards us. He's my legislator. He just lives a few blocks away from me. He was a champion this session on PFAS-related issues because of the big Brunswick PFAS foam spill, but he's also been a champion on a lot of other issues. But in this scene, I can see 5 legislators, probably 5 or 6 lobbyists, a bunch of members of the public, and this is what it looks like in the hallways. And we are trying to connect with lawmakers all session in the halls, in the chamber, at the committees. We're also texting them, phoning them, calling them, emailing them, interacting with them to try to affect the outcome of bills. Next slide. And now we're in the calm waters after the legislative session. And I think we did pretty well. Maine's Environment won, I think, on 75 bills, at least 75 bills. That's my preliminary count, but I think it may go up a little bit. That includes defeating 54 rollback bills. That's a lot of proposals to weaken our environmental laws. But we did pass 21 proactive bills. We're going to touch on a lot of those in the next few minutes. And bills that were not did not receive final action at either at the committee level or because they didn't get funding on the appropriations table will be carried over to next year. So we have a bunch of work to do ahead of us next year, but we are right now relieved and celebrating the results of what overall was a very positive session. So let me now hand it off to Luke Frankel, our Woods, Waters, and Wildlife Director and staff scientist. Take it away, Luke.
Great, thanks, Pete. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to briefly talk about 2 big wins that we had this session related to protecting the North Woods, and then I'm also going to briefly touch on a couple other bills that were also passed this session. So next slide. So this, the first bill, LD 1529, has to do with protecting high-value natural resources here in Maine, and the 2 resources that this bill focused on were older growth forests and undeveloped remote ponds. And so the process that this bill went through this session was it was unanimously ought to pass amended in the ACF committee, and then it passed the House and Senate yesterday. So it is off and awaiting the governor's signature as we speak. And what this bill does, the significance of it is that it's the first time that the legislature is calling on the state to develop, specifically the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, to develop a report on statewide strategies to conserve older growth forests. So this is a big first step into seeing how we can, as a state, come together and protect these valuable resources that we have that are diminishing. And then additionally, the bill also requires that as part of the update for the comprehensive land use plan, that the Land Use Planning Commission will be reviewing protected strategies for undeveloped remote ponds. And so that comprehensive land use plan update will be something that happens this fall and into next year. So we expect that there'll be some additional lake protections added as part of that process as a result of this bill. Next slide. And the other bill that has to do with protecting North Woods that is on its way this session is LD 870. And this bill is about strengthening the actual body, the Land Use Planning Commission, that oversees zoning and planning in over half of the state, pictured on the right there. And so this bill, it received an ought to pass as amended in the ACF committee, and then it passed the House and Senate and was just funded off the appropriations table for $18,000 this year and $11,000 ongoing years after. And so it's awaiting the governor's signature. And what this bill does is it strengthens the LUPC by adding for the first time a tribal representative, which will be jointly selected by the Wabanaki Nations, and an additional appointee who is appointed by the Senate President and House Speaker. And it also updates the qualifications for the commissioners for specific areas that are important in this region, including forestry, land use planning, outdoor recreation, natural resources related businesses, et cetera. So this is really prepping the LUPC for future looking items. Next slide. And so that's Northwoods related. Next, there's another bill that I'm going to be talking about that talks about protecting healthy waters here in Maine. That's LD 1550. Next slide. And this bill has to do with reducing nutrient pollution from septic systems. So this bill received the unanimous ought to pass as amended in the HHS, the Health and Human Services Committee, which isn't a committee we usually are involved in, but that's where the septic rules are housed under. And it passed the House and Senate and was actually signed by the governor back last month. So it is currently law, and this directs the department to update rules governing septic system disposal fields and sandy soils to prevent this issue called short circuiting, which is where the nutrients from the septic systems go through the soils quickly and are untreated and impact waters. And on the right, you'll see a map that we developed in support of this bill that shows the soils at risk across the state of this short circuiting issue. And you can see Sebago Lake has a lot of sandy soils that has this issue. And so this will reduce phosphorus pollution around the state that fuels algae blooms in rivers and lakes. And quickly before I pass it off to Jack, I just also will mention that another priority for us this session was the Lands for Maine Future program and getting funding for that program. And so bills that we were tracking that accomplished that were carried over among the list of bills that Pete mentioned that were carried over. So we'll be continuing to advocate for those bills this upcoming session. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jack, who will talk about getting 100% clean electricity by 2040.
Awesome. Thanks, Luke, and thanks everyone for joining us today. My name's Jack Shapiro. I'm the Climate and Clean Energy Director here at NRCM. And just to sort of set the stage for why we do this work, and I think how it's related to some of the things that Luke just talked about, NRCM has been around for a long time with this mission of protecting Maine's environment. And it's more and more clear all the time that we can't really meaningfully continue that work without addressing climate change, because it is one of the biggest threats that we face to our woods and waters and our wildlife and our communities. And the heat wave that we saw this week in Maine, which fortunately we were able to open up our windows in much of the state this morning, is a really great example. This week we saw multiple places in Maine setting temperature records, and this is an obvious signal of climate change. But it's also notable in the energy context because this Tuesday, because of the air conditioning demand related to the heat, saw the highest electricity demand on the New England grid in more than a decade. And because we're still dependent on fossil fuels, which are what causes climate change, those fossil fuels also drive high energy prices in New England. We're really dependent on natural gas power plants across the region here in Maine and across the region for meeting those power demands. But we're seeing increasingly that renewable energy, and in this case, especially solar, is playing a really big role in helping us meet energy demand on these high demand days. So I think just like recent events, these are the policies that we're working on really are already having practical impacts all the time and are really responsive to the situations that we're seeing in our energy sector. So along these lines, we had some pretty big wins this year in what, as Pete mentioned, was a really busy session. We had a lot of defensive bills that we worked on energy, some of which Rebecca will talk about in just a little bit. But the bills I'm going to talk about today, and you can go to the next slide, Kristen, are LD 1868 and LD 1270. So LD 1868 was our 100% by 2040 bill. This bill started from a goal set by Governor Mills in 2023 and was followed up by years of study of how to implement this goal of reaching 100% clean electricity by 2040. The governor's energy office did the most detailed analysis of Maine's energy system that's ever been done, an hourly study throughout going all the way through 2050. And they found multiple pathways to reach this goal. And the one that got written into the bill is one that raises our existing renewable portfolio standard that was first put in place in the 90s and significantly expanded in 2019, raises that to 90% by 2040, and creates a new category of clean resources, including renewables, as well as some other resources, to meet that last 10%. And what this bill really does is create this clear direction and plan that will help us stabilize energy prices by helping to get rid of that price volatility that comes along with fossil fuels and the global markets that drive those prices. It's going to support our clean energy economy and obviously be the backbone of our climate response. The second bill is LD 1270, is really putting in place some of the structures that are going to help us meet these goals. So it really does two things. First is to create a cabinet level Maine Department of Energy Resources. Most other states have state departments of energy. That's really important for reducing the staff turnover every time an administration changes, maintaining that institutional knowledge, making sure that we don't have people having to sort of go through these learning curves around Maine policy, every few years. And the other part is setting in place a regular schedule of clean energy procurements. So the bill includes sort of a regular energy planning process and a procurement process that's built off of that, so that we're regularly going out, looking at what resources are available, what the needs are, what the opportunities are, the evolution of clean energy technologies, which, as we know, is changing so fast all the time, and goes out and gets that clean energy to really make sure that we're meeting these goals. Next slide, please. So these bills together, I think, represent a really important and major step forward. Between the 100 by 40 clean energy standard and the Maine Department of Energy Resources and Procurements, we're going to be supporting Maine's clean energy economy. We're already seeing significant ratepayer benefits from Maine's existing renewable portfolio standard, and that's something that we can expand on with the expanded RPS and the new clean energy standard. And it supports jobs here in Maine. More than 1,500 people already work in Maine in the clean energy industry. It's also our path to that lower cost clean energy future. Fossil fuels are the primary driver of our high energy prices here in Maine, not just electricity because of natural gas, but also transportation fuels, gasoline and diesel. And 80% of the heating in Maine is either heating oil or propane or another fossil fuel. So really excited to see this go through this year. These are jobs bills, they're energy cost reduction bills, they're climate bills, and they're leadership bills. Showing that Maine is going to continue to move forward because of the logic of clean energy and climate change is still so strong, even when we're seeing some backsliding at the federal level. And I think that was the last one I had, and so I think I'm going to pass it over now to Rebecca, because while we did have some important accomplishments, we also had to play a lot of defense this year, and so I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to talk about a little bit of that.
Hi everyone. Thank you. Thanks, Jack, and thanks everyone for being here. My name is Rebecca Schultz. I'm a senior advocate for climate and clean energy with the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and like Jack said, in 1777, we have one of the big losses of the session in the form of pretty steep cuts to Maine's net energy billing program. We went into the session expecting strong headwinds against Maine's flagship program for rooftop and community solar. And there were at least 9 really bad bills that we worked to defeat, many of them calling for a total repeal of the program. Next slide. But ultimately, the legislature really missed an opportunity for a much more reasonable compromise in reforming net energy billing. And instead, it took a pretty dramatic and disproportionate response to what was an onslaught of misinformation about the high cost of solar energy, which I'll talk more about later. But really, 1777 goes a bit too far. And in terms of specifically what it does, I'll provide some highlights, though this doesn't cover everything. It will slash the compensation for existing solar projects that are already on the grid which will jeopardize the project financing and really call into question the contracts and the solar savings for more than 100,000 program participants. And these are Maine businesses, municipalities, school districts, nonprofits, and community solar subscribers across the state. It does leave in place the rooftop solar program, but it closes the program for all new, what are called front of the meter projects, which will significantly limit access to solar for commercial and institutional entities, as well as Maine families who can't afford to put solar on their own roofs. It creates a 2-year gap, awkwardly, before a successor program can get up and running. And that's just a gap that installers will struggle to bridge, which will lead to closures and job losses. Making these kinds of retroactive cuts to existing contracts will also, we expect, damage the state's reputation as a place to invest in clean energy, which could really hurt our ability to transition away from fossil fuels. Many of these project developers and investors for smaller projects like these are really the same firms that we need to support larger scale renewable energy investments in the state. And then finally, because the law puts in statute these very specific and kind of unjustified project fees for solar, but no other type of generator, LD 1777, along with another bill related to net energy billing cost recovery and LD 1792, have set a really concerning precedent for legislating rate design and ultimately circumventing and politicizing core regulatory functions of the Public Utilities Commission. So it's pretty concerning, I would say, how the whole thing went down, and I can talk more about that, but I want to return to the issue of the cost of solar. We know without a doubt that fossil fuels account for the vast majority of Maine's electricity bills. They drive 60% of costs, while solar comprises roughly 4% of the average household bills. And it's our exposure to fossil fuels through the regional electricity markets that Jack was just describing that leaves Maine households and businesses vulnerable to volatile price hikes like what we experienced with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2021. It was natural gas that was responsible for adding $60 a month to CMP household bills from 2021 to 2023. And really right now we're staring down another natural gas price spike in the wake of repealing the federal incentives for clean energy. And this, again, we're in a situation where Maine families are very vulnerable to those price hikes through the regional markets. So it's through securing homegrown supply of renewable energy that we can overcome this dependence on fossil fuels and provide a long-term pathway to affordable, reliable energy for the state of Maine. And that's exactly what the Net Energy Billing Program has been helping us do. Keep in mind that it is really only through this program that we have successfully built any renewable energy since Governor Mills took office in 2019. Proponents of LD 1777, who were relentlessly focused on short-term bill savings, estimate that this rollback of our net energy billing program will save ratepayers roughly $3 a month off their electric bills. And that's just not a difference that we would expect many families or businesses to notice. And it's not a difference that we think will be worth the level of disruption to our transition to clean energy that LD 1777 will cause. So we'll be watching how this unfolds and how the impacts are felt across the state. And I'll be happy to answer any other questions on this situation in the Q&A afterwards. But for now, I'll pass it off to Josh to talk a bit about transportation highlights. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. My name is Josh. I round out the clean energy team along with Jack and Rebecca, and I've worked a lot on clean transportation this session, so I look forward to sharing some of our successes and near successes, I'll call them. First, I want to start by acknowledging that transportation contributes more to climate pollution than any other sector in Maine by a large margin, and most of that comes from cars and trucks. To respond effectively and meet our climate goals, we need to both transition to electric vehicles, which save money and energy for Mainers, and provide more options for Mainers to get around, including through public transit, safe biking and walking paths, and shared community transportation. Our statewide climate action plan has clear goals on both of these fronts, and more needs to be done to hit them. It's a tough nut to crack for sure. This year, NRCM spent a lot of time in front of the Transportation Committee, which is not historically a stronghold of ours, but we built some really important relationships there, talking to committee members about these aims. We can go to the next slide. This is not an exhaustive list of legislation pertaining to clean transportation that we were tracking, but we did testify on each and every one of these bills and worked with members of the Transportation Committee and beyond to communicate the value of a clean, safe, affordable, and connected transportation system for Maine. We led the campaign this year on Senator Stacey Brenner's LD 1138, an act to reduce pollution associated with transportation in alignment with the state's climate action plan. This bill would have required our state transportation agencies to measure the climate impacts of new transportation projects and invest more in public transit and active transportation. Unfortunately, after successfully passing the bill in the Transportation Committee, which was a big hurdle, and in the Senate, we weren't able to get over the final hurdle in the House, and the bill died in non-concurrence, meaning the House and Senate did not agree to pass the legislation. Nevertheless, we did some really phenomenal organizing around expanding transportation choice for Mainers, and we've positioned ourselves to carry this message forward with our new power and our new relationships despite this legislative setback. We got a ton of support, I'll say as well, and thank you so much to our membership and to all of you on the call who may have contributed to taking action in support of expanding transportation choice for Maine. We were successful on other fronts, including on two key bills to improve public transportation in Maine, LD 1359 and LD 1451. The first asks Maine DOT to implement the recommendations of the Public Transit Advisory Council to improve public transit statewide. And the next, 1451, improves Maine's transportation coordination by establishing a mobility coordination committee tasked with producing a statewide mobility management plan to connect Mainers with their destinations in the most efficient way possible, which is a really essential first step to producing more investment for multimodal transportation. We also saw some big wins on the active transportation front, with LD 29 and LD 30 both passing, which approved the recommendations of two rail use advisory councils to build new biking and walking corridors connecting Portland to Auburn and Brunswick to Augusta. The funding for these projects still needs to be appropriated, but Maine DOT can now move forward on designing and planning. They also tacked on to one of those bills, extending the, in Calais, extending the rail corridor there by an additional 12 miles to complete the final section of the East Coast Greenway connecting to Calais, which is exciting. It would have been great to see LD 1756 move forward to establish clear project selection criteria for new transportation projects, but the Transportation Committee did not feel prepared this session to establish such a new process. And similarly, LD 487 to study the potential of expanding passenger rail from Brunswick to Bangor did not generate enough momentum to emerge favorably out of committee. The bottom line here that I want to emphasize is that Mainers need more options to get to where they need to go beyond cars and trucks. A system based entirely on cars and trucks is expensive, polluting, and dangerous, and investing in alternatives like public transit and biking and walking infrastructure not only helps us hit our climate goals, which we will not do unless we make those investments, but brings huge economic, health, and quality of life benefits to Maine cities and towns. We can go to the next slide now. So we did a lot of work on multimodal transportation advocacy, but I don't want to overlook the great strides that we made on vehicle electrification as well this session. Some of you may have heard that Efficiency Maine last year ran out of funding for electric vehicle rebates due to increased EV demand. So this session, we supported and passed a bill to sustainably fund that program moving forward to ensure that our state continues to recognize the vast benefits that EVs bring for our air, our grid, and our economy. Further, we passed LD 1133 to prevent condominium and HOA associations from banning EV charging to ensure that all Mainers have the opportunity to participate in the EV transition. I'll finish out with a couple of politically charged bills that propose taxing electric vehicles independent from other transportation funding solutions. We do need a sustainable transportation funding solution moving forward, but we can't cave into political pressure and target electric vehicles during a time when EV adoption is more critical than ever. We successfully defeated both of these bills with unanimous Transportation Committee votes in opposition after making a compelling case against this short-sighted approach. We look forward to working with all of you in the coming years to advocate for a transportation system that works for Mainers without negatively impacting our communities and our environment, and look forward to doing that work along with all of you. With that, I'll pass it along to Vanessa.
Amazing, thank you. So for folks who haven't met me, and I know I've seen a lot of familiar faces on here, but my name is Vanessa Berry, and I'm the Sustainable Maine Program Manager for NRCM, and I focus on solid waste policy and issues and all the trash talk. So I'm really excited to be here talking with you about this legislative session. And we can proceed to the next slide. So Maine has already made incredible progress on some solid waste issues in recent years. While we work hard to implement those new policies behind the scenes, we also have to defend against efforts to undermine all of that progress. So in the 132nd legislature, there were several efforts to weaken Maine's strong product stewardship laws and policies to reduce the use of single-use plastics, among several others, but these are the ones I'm going to highlight today. So for example, LD 56 and LD 69 were two bills that were proposed to roll back our statewide ban on plastic bags. NRCM worked with coalition partners and Maine people, including some of you, I see some familiar names here, to dispel misconceptions about the health and safety of reusable bags and emphasize the importance of reducing plastics at the source and phasing out unnecessary plastics. With help from dozens of members who submitted testimony and contacted their lawmakers, we were successful in pushing back against these two proposals, and both bills were defeated. We can move on to the next slide. In this session, we also have LD 1582, which became a perfect example of how NRCM serves as a watchdog, keeping an eye on the development of legislation and mobilizing our membership when bills are brought to our attention that would negatively impact our environment, in addition to our longstanding product stewardship policies. So in this instance, beverage manufacturers were selling product outside of Maine that, and they set to carve out exceptions to Maine's bottle bill program that would allow them to sell this packaging, which is not recyclable and multi-material, and that was currently not allowed in Maine's bottle bill program. NRCM had serious concerns about setting this precedent for granting these exceptions and what this might mean for local redemption centers who have already been struggling to keep up with packaging in recent years. Corporate lobbyists spent a great deal of resources this session spreading misinformation about recycling of their containers and putting pressure on lawmakers to carve out special treatment for their packaging. After monitoring this bill during the public hearing, NRCM learned more about its implications for Maine's bottle bill and quickly mobilized our members and our coalition partners to protect the high standards for packaging within Maine's bottle bill program. And lastly, as a major champion for Maine's extended producer responsibility for packaging law, you may remember in the earlier webinar we did at the beginning of the session, NRCM anticipated that rollback proposals from producers would be imminent. And when we saw the language for LD 1423, we were very concerned that it added several significant exemptions to the program that would leave taxpayers on the hook for managing the cost of the producer's wasteful packaging. So in a good faith effort to collaborate and address a few reasonable concerns from both the environmental groups and folks within Maine's forest products sector, NRCM and others work together to develop an amendment that does not undermine the program, allows for some clarity in key definitions, and actually reduces barriers for municipalities to receive the recycling reimbursements that they deserve. So through that collaboration, LD 1423 quickly shifted from a bad bill to a win-win for both sides, industry and environmentalists, and received bipartisan support in the committee and when it was sent to the Senate and the House for votes, and it was enacted in the final days of session. And I'm ready for the next slide. And while we did spend a lot of time defending our existing environmental laws, which is very important, Maine also managed to advance some sustainability efforts through several new policies, including the passage of LD 1065, which is a food recovery legislation to keep food out of Maine's landfills, which is great. There were some expansions to Maine's waste diversion grant program, which would create more regional solutions for recycling and resource recovery, which is really difficult in more rural parts of the state. And then there were also advancements to the management of products containing PFAS. I know Pete talked a little bit about Representative Dan Ankleys, who was the sponsor of several of these bills, and we're really excited to say that those are in the appropriations table, and they're figuring out funding mechanisms to help get that material stream managed in a more sustainable way. So NRCM will continue to watch these programs closely and keep our members informed as things unfold. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Branya to talk a little bit about tribal sovereignty here in Maine. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. Hi, everyone. I'm Branya. I'm the Grassroots Outreach Manager here with NRCM. And as was mentioned earlier, the mission of NRCM is to protect, restore, and conserve the woods, waters, wildlife, and communities of the place we now call Maine. In that work, we recognize and honor the Wabanaki nations who have stewarded these lands for millennia, long before our organization began. And so because of all of this, NRCM therefore prioritizes tribal sovereignty and self-determination in the legislature. And we're one of the over 300 businesses and organizations that make up the Wabanaki Alliance Tribal Coalition, a group that supports Wabanaki inherent sovereignty and helps advance the work of the Wabanaki Alliance. So I'm going to talk about a few of the priorities of the Wabanaki Alliance that NRCM supported this legislative session. So the first of which is LD 958, an act to prohibit eminent domain on tribal lands. This was a bipartisan bill that amended the 1980 Maine Indian Claims Settlement Implementing Act and the 2023 Micmac Nation Restoration Act to prevent the state from taking Wabanaki land for public uses, often referred to as the right of eminent domain. This would apply to land located within the Passamaquoddy Tribe Territory, Penobscot Nation Territory, Holton Band Trust Land, and the Micmac Nation Trust Land. Most other federally recognized tribes are already afforded protection against states being able to seize tribal lands for public use. And in committee, that bill was amended to stipulate that legislation would apply only to trust lands. The Maine legislature passed this bill with bipartisan support, winning over many legislators who were generally less supportive of previous attempts to provide the Wabanaki Nations greater sovereignty. Unfortunately, Governor Mills vetoed this bill on Tuesday, and there was not the 2/3 majority needed in the State House to override this veto. We are deeply disappointed in this veto, but we are also not surprised since the governor has vetoed every Wabanaki Alliance endorsed legislation. We're going to be following the Wabanaki Alliance's lead in next steps. The other bill I'll mention, two more, LD 14, an act to provide Indigenous peoples free access to state parks. So that would provide a citizen of a federally recognized Indian nation, tribe, or band in Maine to not be required to pay a fee for admission to any state-owned park. The bill passed under the hammer and in the Senate and in the House, and has been placed on the appropriations table to await a funding decision and final enactment by the state. It was actually, okay, update not funded, and it's carried over to 2026. LD 395, which is also the big tribal sovereignty bill to ensure the state of Maine recognizes inherent sovereignty of the Wabanaki nations, was also carried over to 2026. And so hopefully with these bills carried over, that'll provide some time to gather the support to override a veto. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Emmy.
Thanks, Branya, and thanks everyone for sharing all those updates on our priority bills. We soon will have some time for questions, and I know that some have been coming in. We're tracking those, and we'll start asking them shortly. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or in the question and answer box. And if we don't get to a question, we will follow up via email. Just real quickly, though, I do want to share some ways that you can continue to stay engaged with us on these issues and more. This summer, NRCM staff are hitting the road across Maine for a series of meet and greets to meet with our members and supporters, to celebrate these shared victories, discuss the road ahead, and to connect with each other. You can learn more about those events and register on our website at nrcm.org/events. We also every year have an annual award called our People's Choice Award, which honors a Mainer who has gone above and beyond to protect the environment in a volunteer capacity. And we are now asking for nominations. So if you know somebody who you think would be a good candidate, please send in your nominations to us before Friday, July 11th. And you can find information on how to do that on our website as well. All right, let's get into some of the questions. There are a lot of questions on net energy billing. No surprise, probably. So Rebecca, I'm trying to consolidate a few of these for you. We have questions from Cheryl, Sue, Thomas, and Daniel. Is the retroactive nature of the cancellation of existing contracts lawful, is one question. Does 1777 mean that existing projects will no longer be able to bank solar credits in the summer and use them to offset the costs in the winter? How will, and I can re-say these to you, Rebecca, how will new net billing legislation affect rooftop solar? And kind of similarly, is rooftop solar still safe and continuing to be unchanged?
Yeah, thanks for relaying those questions, and thanks for asking the questions. Rooftop solar is still safe, both existing projects and looking forward. They're still permitted to proceed as they have in the past, even in light of LD 1777. So that was a big point of contention, was how to protect rooftop solar. So this bill will not affect rooftop solar, and it will not affect the bankability of credits as they're currently handled right now for those same rooftop projects. So that those projects are not affected. There was another question about the lawfulness. So LD 1777 doesn't directly cancel any contracts per se. What it does do is change the compensation that's paid to projects. And in the case of a certain subset of the project of the program, it will sort of add an additional slate of fees to the projects that in some cases will be very large. So for the larger end of the spectrum of projects between 3 and 5 megawatts, projects will have to pay an additional $360,000 a year. So insofar as the contracts being affected, it would be in how that financing, how that those additional fees and charges will affect project financing, because these projects are already up and running. They already have their land contracts, their leases, their contracts with the folks who have agreed to use the energy. And so it's all of that cascade of contracts that will need to be reappreciated and potentially renegotiated and potentially canceled. We'll just have to see. That will be on a project by project basis. I think that that there's still room for lawsuits for sure here, though I don't want to speculate on that. And did I hit most of the questions there? I think I did.
I think you did too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And there are a few more that are coming in, I think, that we'll answer over email though. So Julia, I saw yours and there's a few more coming in, but we'll follow up on those for email. Pete, this question I think is for you. It's a question from Brian. What will NRCM be doing within the gubernatorial election to either vet candidates or inform voters on their records and intentions?
NRCM is a 501c3 organization, so that means that under IRS codes, we can receive tax-deductible donations, but we cannot participate in candidate elections. So there's nothing that NRCM has done in the past or that can do in the future that would affect the outcome of elections in the form of endorsements of a candidate or positive statements or negative statements that are specific to a candidate. All we can do and what we will do is continue to provide information available to any and all candidates and any and all people in the state to learn and develop their own opinions about positions. But for information about particular candidate positions, you'll want to go to Maine Conservation Voters and look at their website, and they have a 501c3 tax status that enables them to receive non-tax deductible donations and to be involved in candidate elections.
All right, thanks. Jack and Rebecca, I think this one is for you guys. Question from Daniel. During the heat wave, there were multiple power outages throughout the state. I assume that was because the grid could not handle the demand. As we promote more electrification, how will we ensure that the grid can handle increasing demand?
I can start, and then Rebecca, maybe you can fill in. I think there are multiple ways to think about whether the grid can quote unquote handle demand. And I haven't seen anything definitive on what caused any particular outage. I know that there were not sort of widespread outages that affected like people on the like entire grid scale. And so at the moment, we don't have a supply problem. There is adequate amounts of energy supply to meet demand. And I think as we think about our work leading up to achieving this goal of 100% clean electricity by 2040, we want to make sure that not only are we building new renewable energy resources to displace the existing fossil fuel generation, which has climate impacts and also this sort of cost volatility impacts, but we're also building enough renewable energy to meet additional demand as more people switch from fossil fuel heating to heat pumps, which is electric and increases demand. As more people switch from gasoline and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles, that's additional demand. It's interesting to note. I know I saw something in the chat where people were talking about consumption and efficiency. As we move towards a more electrified approach to energy away from fossil fuels, while electricity demand is expected to go up, maybe by about double, our overall energy use will go down significantly because fossil fuels are so inefficient. Like a gas car only is 20% efficient. Most of that just goes out through the radiator. Most of that energy goes out through the radiator as heat. Heat pumps are much more efficient than fossil fuel furnaces in heating a space. So while our electricity use goes up, our actual overall energy use goes down by about half. So electrification is inherently efficient. So that's sort of the supply side piece of things. I think the other side of it is the grid infrastructure piece. And so, Rebecca, I don't know if you have any reflections on that as we look ahead, or reflections on that as it relates to the events this week.
Yeah, I think the thing I would add is that one of the things that we need to be doing as we undertake this clean energy transition is more sort of what's called balancing of the grid at the local and state level, so that we can respond to increases in demand where they occur by providing energy and building energy resources in that part of the grid. And that means small scale solar paired with batteries, for instance, that can respond to needs below the circuit, for instance, in a certain section of the grid, so that we don't have to go upstream and rely on energy from the regional market, where you have these oil and gas and coal plants that are brought on during these most expensive times of the day, or times of the year rather, like what we saw on Tuesday that you're referring to. And call up those very expensive resources. We can respond here by flexing demand with supply at the local level. And that really is the direction that we need to head. And that's the direction that we have been trying to head with respect to some targeted investments and programming that are happening at this sort of innovation frontier in Maine and around the country. And that means, sort of pre-chilling your house with, ramping up your AC unit prior to those peak hours of the day, for instance. That means having our EVs programmed to only charge during certain times of the day, or possibly eventually discharge when you're having these high demand moments, hours and whatnot. And certainly storage is the big next step there, where we're deploying storage paired with solar, and having that organized by aggregators, by third parties, or maybe potentially the utilities or Efficiency Maine Trust, to be able to respond to the needs on the main grid when those needs are present. So I'll stop there. But
All right, thank you. The next question is also coming from Daniel again. Why did the Clean Transportation Bill not pass the House? Who were the opponents and how did they manage to win? Or in other words, what do we need to do next time to combat the opposition? And Josh, I'll hand that off to you.
Oh, yeah, it's a good question, and unfortunate that it didn't make it through the House. I do want to mention here a few context things. NRCM, to our knowledge, has not passed a bill through the Transportation Committee, let alone the House and Senate, that is environmentally or climate oriented. So this was the first bill that we've ever worked on that passed out of the Transportation Committee, which is a huge success in and of itself. It then moved on to the Senate, and it did pass again there, and we actually did get bipartisan support in the Senate, which was a really phenomenal thing. The House was a struggle all session for a lot of our issues. The reason for that is that there were 73 Republicans and 76 Democrats. and 2 independents. So you could not lose a lot of votes if there was a perceived partisan issue. And unfortunately, a lot of issues in our political sphere right now are perceived as partisan. Because this bill sought to align our transportation planning with our climate action plan goals, it was perceived as partisan. And so the Republicans voted as a block against it in the House. For that reason, we had to keep all the Democrats and independents in line. And unfortunately, the road lobby, those trade associations and groups that are dedicated to ensuring that the maintenance and building of new roads and bridges continues forward, was really powerful and was able to pull off a few of the Democrats and independents that we otherwise thought would have voted for legislation like this. The last thing I'll note is that legislation has fiscal notes occasionally if agencies believe that it will cost money to implement the legislation. Our fiscal note for LD 1138 was way higher than we think it should have been. It was about $1.8 million per biennium was the estimate for how much it would cost to just implement this system, even though we've seen other states like Colorado and Minnesota implement similar legislation for much, much less expense. And those states are larger than Maine as well. So that fiscal note, the thought that it might cost the state that much money to implement the program was, I think, enough to scare off a few of the House members who were concerned that they'd be supporting something that was too expensive for the state to handle. So those were a couple of our takeaways. I think in the future, we'll continue to advocate for multimodal transportation and just try to make sure to underscore that more transportation choice is good for Maine on so many fronts. It is not just our climate response. It is needed for our climate response, but it is so good for local economies. Every dollar we invest in public transit leads to $5 in locally generated economic value. So, we'll continue to make the argument from many different perspectives and seek to just grow the coalition so that it's not simply an environmental bill or perceived as an environmental bill, but really something that all Mainers can get behind.
Thanks, Josh. Luke, this next question is for you. LD 1529 sounds like a great first step for conserving older growth forest. What are the next steps to protect that resource?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, as I stated, this bill outlines strategies that the state is going to recommend for conserving old growth forests. So the next step would be working to enact those strategies. And so depending on kind of what the state agencies decide on those strategies, there are a couple avenues. For example, in the testimony, a lot in the public hearing for that bill, a lot of conversation came up about forest certification standards, and there are a couple clauses in the SFI and FSC certifications that a lot of common wood products and all of forestry companies, they're certified by these agencies, and they're required to under the certifications protect habitat for certain species and things like that. So there are other avenues that and depending on what the strategies that are recommended in Maine, actually implementing those strategies could be conservation through programs like LMF, things of that nature. So we're curious to see if this legislation continues to move forward, what strategies the state comes up with, and we'll be continuing to stay engaged as those strategies are recommended and starting to be put into place.
Thanks, Luke. I know we didn't get to all of the questions. We're gonna do one last question, and then we will definitely follow up on the ones we didn't get to via email. The last question comes from Sean and Pete, but could answer it, but really anyone. For the big losses that we had, are there any takeaways or lessons learned that we can take into next year?
Well, we really don't like to lose. So we spend a good bit of time figuring out what the lessons learned are to avoid that situation in future years. And we win way more than we lose because we do tap into the power of our supporters, Maine people, and the wisdom of our legislative champions. And generally speaking, Maine lawmakers are not particularly persuaded that we should be wrecking our environment. So generally, we are able to tap into bipartisan support on most issues, but it's when there's big national interests that come in that the natural gas sector, the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry, the packaging industry, when they come in with their lobbyists, it often is just challenging for us to actually, you know, have as much power and influence and talk to as many legislators. So, you know, the lesson is we just need your support. We need to continue to be at the State House, which is critical for what we do as an organization. And we just need to build bigger and stronger coalitions and just keep doing what we do. But the big takeaway is, you know, we defeated 54 bad bills and we put in place 21 proactive bills, and that's pretty good. So we'll try to make sure that the losses are even fewer next year with your help.
Thanks, Pete. And thanks everyone again for joining us today. NRCM is a membership organization, as Pete said, and our work really is powered by member support. Our members are at the heart of everything we do, and we're so grateful to have you as part of our community. Thanks to everyone on this call who is an NRCM member. And if you are not a member yet, we hope that you'll join us today. And like I said, if you didn't get your question answered, we'll definitely be following up via email with some resources, this recording and slides, as well as a podcast episode that features Pete, and that will be sent out next week. So keep your eyes open for that. And thanks again so much for joining us today, and hope you have a good rest of your day.